Hello, this is Eric Thomas, and I am an instructor at the University of Kansas's William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications, and I'm also the Executive Director of the Kansas Scholastic Press Association. I come to you after a decade of teaching at St. Teresa's Academy as well, and I'm really excited today to be presenting to you a presentation that I'm calling Wouldn't Touch It with a 10-Foot Pole, where I will explain to you why I think it is dangerous and misleading to use polls in your student publication that you have administered yourself. So let's go ahead and dive in here. The idea that I'm going to really start with and frame the entire presentation around is the idea that all good journalism starts with some sort of a question. We always ask you as journalists to be curious people, and so that means asking a good question that you want to find the answer to, one that you don't know the answer to yet. And sometimes when we do that, we think, like, what is this question that we want to ask? How do we ask that question? And the question could be asked in so many different venues. We've taught these to you as journalism teachers. We've said, go out and interview people in person, maybe email them, maybe schedule a Zoom interview with them or talk on the phone with them, maybe meet with a group of students all at once and ask them questions together. Maybe you go out and you're really ambitious and you collect public records, or maybe you even read professional media and use that as part of your research as well. One of the things that I don't think we say very often is something like this. Do we often ask you, hey, young journalist, why don't you go ahead and throw out a poll on your Twitter feed today about teen sex and use those 55 responses to represent your school of well over 1,000 students? Well, obviously, we're kind of snickering at that idea because it's a really, really bad idea. Why is that a bad idea? Why are these terrible ways to get the information that we're trying to find out? Well, I think we can all imagine that if we go ahead and put that kind of a survey out into the field on social media, that we're really inviting people to present joke answers or to lie about what their teen sex life has been like, right? We would assume that there's going to be lots of goofing around. We also are going to see tons and tons of small samples when we get questions like this, right? We only have 55 responses to this survey, and probably for good reason. If we're asking people to tell us this sensitive information online, not very many people are responding. So that is potentially misleading once we get our results. We might not even get students from our high school. Maybe they are students from a rival high school. Maybe they are students from all the way across the country. Maybe they aren't students at all. By putting this out on public social media, we really don't know who we're actually surveying and who is letting us know what their habits are. And then the final thing that we are inviting here is the idea of ballot stuffing. And you've seen this so many times before, where somebody votes many times for a team that they want to win, or for a result that they want to win on some sort of online poll. And student media isn't the only ones who ask silly questions like this and then make a big deal of the results. This just happened last week here in Kansas City. The Kansas City Star put out this survey, and they asked, what restaurant would you like to have here in Kansas City? What are you most excited about coming here? And as of 4:30 p.m. on the 14th, it was overwhelmingly a new restaurant called Prime Social. They had 48% of the vote, whereas Whataburger only had 23% of the vote. Now, the Kansas City Star went ahead and published an article based on this. And that article said, these preliminary findings say that Prime Social is the restaurant that you're most excited about. And then not even a day later, they went ahead and updated that poll, and they said, actually, Whataburger is the place that you want here in Kansas City more than any other place. Obviously, there's tons of ballot stuffing here while people are, maybe putting out on their own social media for Whataburger or for Prime Social, where they're trying to get people to respond in that way. So these online polls are really, really fraught. So how can we think about researching these kinds of questions without using polling or by using polling responsibly? I think that we should start with this simple rule, especially for student media, but also for the professional media, and that is to avoid polls that you, as an amateur pollster, are going to put out there, right? Polling is hard. It takes many, many years of training and expertise to get it right, and you, someone who's putting it out there, you are just being trained as a journalist, probably now in high school, and so polling is not your expertise. So my advice is to avoid these polls and just not use them. Why would I say that? The first reason I would say it is because that's what the professionals do. I'm going to show you a couple of different articles here from really professional and well-respected publications, and you can see how they avoid using their own polls. So the first story that I'm going to show you is a story from a few years ago by the New York Times, and they wanted to write a story about vaping and how it is affecting young people. And so here's what they wrote about college campuses. Here's the headline: Vaping on campus, no parents, no principals, a big problem. Despite a growing health crisis that has killed more than 50 people, vaping has become an irresistible and addictive part of life for many college students. Now, if this was a college newspaper, I think that the instinct would be that the college newspaper would try to do its own poll. But look what the New York Times did. The New York Times included this paragraph in their story. In a national survey of more than nearly 1,000 college students conducted earlier this year by Butler University in Indianapolis, more than half said they had used a Juul, the leading e-cigarette brand and prime target of regulators. An annual study by the University of Michigan found that the use of vaping products for nicotine and marijuana had doubled among college students between 2017 and 2018, one of the largest proportional increases since the study of adult drug use began more than 40 years ago. Now, the New York Times here isn't relying on its own polling, as I think you probably anticipated. Instead, it's relying on Butler University and the University of Michigan. It's relying on studies of more than 1,000 students, college students, and it's relying on a study that began more than 40 years ago. Not only are they using these studies, but they're kind of bragging about the quality of their sources within their article, which is a really good way to prove to your readers that, yes, you can trust me. That's probably not going to be the case if you administer your own poll. They aren't going to be impressed and persuaded. Let's go ahead and use another example here. This is one, it was from the initial example that I used for this presentation, which is The Atlantic writing about teen sex. They wrote a very well-known article a few years ago that said, why are young people having so little sex, right? With the birds and the bees image at the top of it. And what we see here is that they also did not go ahead and try to do their own polling. On the left-hand side here, we see the excerpt that they used, and you can see that they're not relying on going out and asking teens about their sex lives. Instead, they are relying on a survey that's been around for many decades and is created by the CDC, a federal agency, right? And so this is the kind of research that if I was reading the article, I'm going to be much more trustworthy about. And you can see that they even link it here in the excerpt, saying that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Youth Risk Behavior Survey finds the percentage of high school students who'd had intercourse dropped from 54% to 40%. And so they're able to draw conclusions off of that because it's very, very solid data. Other examples, this one from Education Week, the use of exams and the Common Core. This is not the New York Times, it's not the Atlantic, but it is an education publication. And so we would think maybe they'll do their own polling because they know their topic of Education Week very, very well. They did an infographic. This isn't for a story. They did their own infographic. And that infographic doesn't rely on their own polling either. Instead, to find out the attitudes toward these assessments, we go ahead and rely on two different surveys that were done by polling organizations. In one case, Gallup, and in the other case, a partnership between the Associated Press and another organization. So we see over and over again that student publications, when they do their own polling, are trying to be even more ambitious than professional publications are trying to be. And that should make us nervous. We are trying to do things as student journalists that professionals don't even trust themselves to do. So let's return to our idea that all good journalism starts with a question. It starts with an original, local, and narrow question, but as we just figured out, we don't want it to be a question that demands our staff to do polling, right? We're going to avoid sending our staff towards doing polling by asking a question that demands it. We don't want to dig that hole before we even start doing our reporting. So here's a bad pitch that I think someone on your staff might give you. I think we should survey our teens on their weight before, during, and after the pandemic. Why is that a bad idea? I think that it's a much better idea to go ahead and trace other people's reporting on things like this. There are other people who are actually doing this reporting right now. A better question would be, is our school community surprised by the national trend that shows kids and teens gaining weight during the pandemic? What could be influencing that locally? I wouldn't want to do any local polling on how much teens weigh because I think that's a really sensitive question and I don't think they're going to tell me the truth. Otherwise, though, we are going to find that national surveys are going to find the truth about this question. For instance, here's the story that we could go ahead and reference. This story says children and teens gained weight at an alarming rate during the pandemic, the CDC says. If we go into this NPR story, we'll find that the study published on Thursday looked at 400,000 people between the ages of 2 and 19 years old. That is astonishing. We could never do anything that would come close to doing that in our local community. And while we might think our local community is so much different from the rest of the nation, chances are it is more similar than it is different in that way. So if we click through to that study there, what we're going to find is the actual study that the CDC did. And this is going to get pretty wonky, and you might think to yourself, I'm not sure I want to read a really, really long peer-reviewed medical study about teen and adolescent weight gain. But look at some of the gems that are hidden inside of here. For instance, there are some charts and graphs that are in here that we could use to create our own infographics or to put in front of people and say, hey, is this surprising to you, school nurse, that these trends are happening? Is this surprising to you, local pediatrician? Is this surprising to you, physical education teacher? What are you seeing in your life? Is it matching up with what we see here? Or we could use these charts in our coverage itself. We can also see the raw numbers that are in here, and we could start using some of those as well if we wanted to even narrow down the focus of our story even more. So that's how I would go ahead and use a story idea and go to the actual source and find better polling elsewhere. What if you don't know what to write about? What if you can't even come up with a question? Well, I think that polling can go ahead and fix that for us because so many studies are already created. It's just a matter of going out there and finding it. So if we go find a study about teenagers, then we're probably going to get a story idea out of it. For instance, I found this one very quickly today. Studies suggest artificial turf is to blame for an increased increased rate of injury for athletes. How do our school's athletes and coaches feel about that? Where does that story come from? Well, there's a website. When I typed in teen health, this was what came up for me, the National Center for Health Research. I did a little bit of looking around on the website and made sure that it was trustworthy, and there are really, really decorated people who work here, so I feel really good about using it. And when I clicked on the website, I saw over on the right-hand side that there's a whole set of links over here about child and teen health. And look at the very, very first headline down there, injuries related to artificial turf. Chances are your school, like my children's school, has a field with artificial turf on it. And so you can write a story about this. The bottom line, according to this research group, is that many studies have examined the injury rates and that there are lots of things to be concerned about there. There are concerns regarding the chemicals that can be found in the turf. These small rubber pieces are used not only for small sports fields, but playgrounds, putting young children at risk of harmful side effects. This could be something that you could localize to your own school without having to go do your own medical study. Here's the next example of a question that we can make much better by thinking about polling in a different way. Maybe you think to yourself, there has been a lot of writing recently about LGBTQ teens, and we want to put numbers to that at our school. Well, I think you can imagine, again, if you put this question out on Twitter, if you go ask people, they're going to have a really hard time and understandably being honest with you. Some students aren't ready to talk about their sexuality, and they might not be willing to out themselves to you as a reporter, which is totally understandable. But maybe somebody else has already done that study, and the reality is they probably have, right? So here is a much better question. How have the rising rates of Americans who identify as LGBTQ affected Sunflower High School, that's the made-up high school I'm going to use here, students' decisions to come out or not to come out? That study is shown right here, and we can see that it's from the polling organization Gallup, and they are putting a number to the nationwide presence of LGBTQ people. And so how can we use that for our local publication? Well, what if we paired that with interviews with local LGBTQ activists or LGBTQ students from your school who are willing to be identified? That could be a much more interesting story and a much better way of spending our time than trying to create a poll that isn't trustworthy in the first place. Here's another question that we're going to go ahead and improve. What percentage of teens at Sunflower High School are addicted to social media? This is, again, a very sensitive question, and people aren't going to likely be very forthcoming about the answer to it. So what can we do about that question to make it more doable for our staff? Well, maybe we go ahead and use just really simple Google to try to find some of the answers to what could be newsworthy for teens. I like to do this all the time. If you just Google teen in the news section of Google, you're going to find really interesting stories. So one of the stories that we will find here is, how do Sunflower High School students react to the news that TikTok may be causing tics in teen girls? This is a story that just came out this week, and I found it by just simply going to news on Google and typing in teens. This should be almost a weekly occurrence on your news staff to just type in teens into the news feed and see what's going on there and see if there are conversations that you can connect to. Here's the conversation, which is that teen girls are developing tics, and many doctors think that it is a result of using TikTok. The story links throughout this presentation are blue, and I'll share the presentation with you so you can find your way to these stories, including this one from the Wall Street Journal. Here's an excerpt from that story, which says, since March 2020, Texas Children's Hospital has reported seeing approximately 60 teens with such tics, whereas doctors there saw 1 or 2 cases a year before the pandemic. Well, that's a really noteworthy change, and it's nothing that I, as a student journalist, could go out and study on my own. So going ahead and using the studies that are being done and being cited in professional media, there's nothing wrong with doing that at all. Okay? Here are some questioning words that will help you to avoid forcing your staff into doing polling questions. For instance, I think it's really good to ask questions that involve how rather than how many, right? So this question right here, how has COVID-19 worker shortage affected students during lunchtime? Rather than saying how do they feel about it or how many students aren't getting their lunch, we're just asking how it has affected them, and there are many, many different ways that we can answer that question without relying on polling. Or we might ask why. Polling is terrible at answering why generally, and so if we want to go ahead and answer this why question, why are clubs at Sunflower High School requiring service hours this year? Well, that's not necessarily something that we can poll about. We're just going to need to go out and do that research, and that's certainly something that's answerable. I also think as a professor who teaches lots and lots of visual classes that we should try to choose visual words. Things like, what did it look like when Sunflower High School Climbing Club went to Arkansas last week? Instead of asking, how they responded to it, in that way, that might really force us toward polling. Using visual words like looks like encourages us to take pictures and to answer that question in a different way. Another great word to use in your questions or your story ideas is to use the word experiences, because experiences really invites you to do good interviewing rather than doing good polling. So what experiences are juniors having with the limited parking situation at Sunflower High School during construction this semester? That's something that I think is much better answered through interviewing and couldn't be accomplished through polling. If you do insist on polling, and I hope you don't, I hope that you can figure out a different way to cover the story. If you do, let's give you just a few tips in case that you're going to. Here are the worst practices in terms of doing polls yourself. The worst practices are social media polls. You should not rely on them because they are open generally to anyone. You should also be very nervous about polls with small sample sizes, with very few students in the poll. You should also be nervous about limited time polls. If they're only up there for a few hours, then you're only getting a very, very small window of people's impressions. You should also be very nervous, as we've talked about before, about topics like sex or drugs or illegal activity, because people are not going to be very honest with you about these things, and again, for good reason. We should also be very concerned about polls that represent large groups. We don't want to go ahead and say this small poll represents the view of many, many people. What are the best practices for polling? Well, the best practice for polling is a very simple sentence that has many different considerations underneath it. That is, a fair sample is a representative sample. If you have gone ahead and polled using a fair sample, that means that every student has the same likelihood of being selected. What does that mean? Well, that means a lot of really, really tricky things. For instance, if you only poll in one place in the school, then you're likely to get students who maybe have a particular interest area. So if you ask a question about how important is the football team, but you ask that question in the art hallway, well, you might get a sample of students that doesn't represent the entire school. The same thing is true if you ask a question about volleyball while the volleyball team is practicing. You're not going to give those students who are part of volleyball, they're not going to have a chance to respond to the survey. So you need to think about when and where and how and who you are surveying and how you're going to make sure that every single person has the same random chance at being selected for the poll. What else are the best practices? I think this is kind of the golden rule of polling, and that is, what would you want the poll to look like if it was about something that was really important to you? You're sitting here listening to me, so what if the poll was, we're thinking about getting rid of newspaper or yearbook or publications at our school. We're going to do a poll about that. How would you want the administration to do a poll like that? Well, you would want every single student to have a good chance at responding to that poll, and you would want them to be rigorous. If you want them to be rigorous, then you should be rigorous too in creating your poll and executing it as well. And then finally, this idea of how do we publish this information so that our readers understand. I think that we need to explain as the media what we have done to make our poll happen. So as an example here, and this may seem over the top to you, but this is what readers want. This is what readers demand. The Sunflower News polled 135 randomly chosen seniors during lunch hour during the week of October 25th, allowing students to submit anonymously. The poll has a margin of error of plus or minus 7 percentage points. We see a couple things that are important there. We know how many people were polled. We know what the sample was drawn from, what the entire population size is, in this case, seniors at the school. We know when it was done. We know even where it was done, and then we know the margin of error as well. All of those things are very important for us as a reader to be able to make context out of a poll. I was really excited to do this presentation because I had a great discussion on this podcast that School Newspapers Online does. If you're interested in listening to me babble on some more about polling and why student journalists should be really nervous about it, I'm putting a link here in the presentation notes, so I hope you connect to that resource as well. Again, my name is Eric Thomas. I'm coming to you from the University of Kansas. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. I hope that it changes the way that your student publication thinks about polling, and I hope it was helpful.